Windmill comes to life. In chapter 10, William was trying his very best to get all the pieces he needs to create a windmill. Remember, a windmill is this thing here, okay? Which he's using a bike, he's using bits of a pipe to make the fans, and he needs wires, and he needs a generator. So he needs all these different pieces so that when the wind blows here, it moves, it spins, which spins the bike's wheels, which starts to create electricity, which he can then take in a wire to his house. The windmill comes to life. The following afternoon, I began assembling and creating the machine. I dragged the bicycle, tractor fans, blades, bolts, and dynamo outside and arranged them along in the dirt. I had chosen an area behind the kitchen, which doubled as my laboratory. The acacia tree provided plenty of shade against the mid-morning sun, and I had also determined it was the best place to catch the eastern wind that rushed over the highlands from the lake. The first thing I wanted to do was connect the blades to the tractor fan. This called for a drill. So I went into the kitchen and stuck the cob-handled nail into the fire, and once it glowed red hot, I bored a square pattern of 4 holes in each top of each plastic blade, plus 2 more in the center. This process of heating, melting, and reheating took almost 3 hours. Next, I emptied the sack of nuts and bolts that Gilbert had given me onto the ground and started to fasten and strengthen the first blade. That's when I'd realized I had forgotten the washers. Ah! I shouted, frustrated with myself. So what these are they basically, you attach them to something and it means it won't be able to move. Okay, so it's keeping it nice and secure. And you need all of these parts. You need the nut, the bolt, and the washer together to make this happen. Well, I definitely needed washers to secure the bolts, so I spent the next hour collecting bottle caps outside Ufesi Boozing Center. Once I had about 20, I hurried home. I hammered them flat, and I used a nail to poke a hole through their middles. Perfect. One by one, I drove bolts through each washer and tightened the nuts until all 4 blades were connected, the thing he made out of pipe. Lastly, I wanted to make sure that the blades were strong and wouldn't snap in a heavy wind. So I wired 3 3-foot bamboo reinforcements to each one, to where they acted like a bone, so keeping it strong. Okay now, I said, let's have a look. I stood back to examine my work. From end to end, the wingspan of the blades stretched more than 8 feet, causing me to giggle with excitement. It was then that I noticed the compound were empty. My sisters were off running errands buying things, and my father was attending a funeral in a nearby village. Besides my clinking and hammering, the only other noise was my mother, singing to herself in the kitchen as she prepared a pot of beans for our supper. The privilege of privacy was mine, and I fell into deep concentration. The next thing was to figure out how to connect everything to the bicycle, which wasn't going to be easy. I started by steadying the blades atop 4 tall bricks, like how a mechanic puts a car on blocks, so I would have some room to work with underneath. Then came the hardest part. The bicycle was not only heavy, but cumbersome, especially with a giant shock absorber sticking out from the crankset. But I managed to lift it high enough to flip it over, then dropped the shock absorber into the center hole of the tractor fan. So he's trying to put everything together. The bike's heavy. There's a lot of materials. Quickly, I crouched down underneath the bricks and jammed a cotter pin through the other end, locking it tight. Finally, I attached the dynamo to the bike frame so its metal wheel hugged against the side wall of the tire. I strung the chain, which was coated in warm black grease, over the crankset and made sure it held tight against the sprockets. Now, if you're not understanding a lot of what's going on, it's basically him putting together the different pieces of the windmill. As you can see here, he had to create all of that and put it together. By the time I finished the chain, the sun was setting behind the trees, and soon it would be too dark to work. I packed my tools away in my room, then moved the windmill against the wall of the kitchen and out of the way. I drew a bucket of water from the well and heated it for my bath. and after bathing I headed inside for supper. But then my sister Rose returned from the shops and saw me in the courtyard. "William, we haven't seen you all day," she said. "People in the trading center were asking about you." "Well, today your brother was busy," I said. "I told them you were playing with your metals to make power." "Something like that," I said, smiling. "Just wait. Soon you'll be in for a surprise along with everyone else." I ate my supper like a real working man, saying nothing except to utter a few well-orchestrated grunts. When I finished eating, I returned to my room, lay down on my bed, and I was asleep in seconds. The following morning, I was awake at the first light and ready to continue. My plan was to build a tall wooden tower for the windmill, but first I had to see if it even worked. For this, I needed something temporary. So I found a thick piece of bamboo, more than 6 inches wide, and I made a hole through the top, then drove the other end into the dirt. So he's putting a big piece of bamboo into the floor. I finished just in time to see Geoffrey ride up on his bicycle from Jipumba. It happened to be his day off and he was coming to visit me. "Hey man, just in time," I said. "Is this the project you were working on?" "Yeah, this is everything. I'm glad you're here, friend. Help me lift this thing." We locked up the bicycle wheel and chain to keep them from spinning, then carefully hoisted and put the machine onto the pole, onto the bamboo that's in the ground. I was out of rope, so once it felt strong and sturdy, Geoffrey secured it using long strips from an inner tube. "Shall we?" he asked. "We shall." Geoffrey unlocked the tire so the blades could spin. Except we didn't realize how quickly this would happen. In Malawi, the wind is never still. Within seconds, the blades were spinning so fast, the chain snapped in half and the pole nearly tipped over. "Hold it!" I shouted. Geoffrey and I barely managed to catch the machine before it crashed to the ground and broke apart. Once we had a grip and held it, I twisted the pole and turned the blades out of the wind's direction. Then I spent the next 2 hours fixing the chain. The main reason for the test was to see if the dynamo produced enough current, enough electricity. I already knew it could power a small bicycle lamp, but what else? I went to my father's room and grabbed his international radio, which was forbidden to me, given my history with the family's other electronics. When I returned, Geoffrey gave me a look. "Does your father know you're borrowing this?" he asked. I waved him off. "He's in the trading center. He'd never know it was gone." I jammed the dynamite's 2 wires into the radio's AC socket and Geoffrey unlocked the windmill blades. They began to move and twirl and the dynamo's metal wheel zipped against the spinning tire. For the slightest moment, I heard music. It worked! But a second later, black smoke started to pour out of the speakers of the radio, of his father's radio. "Oh no," Geoffrey said and ripped out of the wires. The radio sat between us, sizzling like an egg. He spun around, looking for my father, but I was too excited to care. "Did you see that power?" I screamed, jumping up and down. "Did you see it?" So he created electricity from the wind. The radio blew up because the dynamo produced too many volts of electricity. Voltage, as I had learned in my books, is how you measure electrical pressure, the amount of electricity. Think of it like the water pressure coming out of a hose. The dynamo produced 12 volts when something was pedaling like normal. This was enough for a radio or light bulb to manage. But when the wind gusted and was strong and spun the blades like crazy, it caused a power surge that increased the voltage, the amount of electricity, and it fried my father's radio. I had to figure out how to reduce it. I read and flipped through explaining physics to where it showed a diagram of 2 separating light bulbs, both being lit from a low 12-volt AC supply, exactly like my dynamo. Both bulbs were connected by long wires. One bulb burned very brightly, all because of something called a transformer, which boosted the voltage and made it stronger. But the second bulb didn't have a transformer and glowed dim and yellow. That's because without the transformer, power was lost in the form of heat on its journey through the wires, something called dissipation. "Mr. Geoffrey," I said, "since energy can be lost in the wires when traveling long distances, Perhaps we can try this on a dynamo. I went into our big pile of radio parts and found an old motor. I cracked it open, removed everything, and unwound the long copper wire. I then wrapped it around a stick, creating my own kind of reverse transformer. I attached one end of the wire to the dynamo and the other end to my father's radio, which somehow managed to survive the power surge. Just like in the book, I was giving the electricity an extra long road to travel, hoping some of its voltage would get lost along the way. So to make sure that his father's radio doesn't blow up, because it has too much electricity, he's creating a longer road, a longer area for the electricity to travel so it gets down a bit. Okay, try it again, I said to Joffrey. He unlocked the blades and the wheel, and dynamo began to whir. This time, there was only music. Our test was complete. The windmill sat on the bamboo pole for 2 days, hidden behind the house and out of sight. In the meantime, Joffrey, Gilbert, and I set out to build a real tower. The three of us met in front of my house one morning with our panga machetes and walked into the blue gum forest. It was the same grove of trees where I had sought refuge from bubblegum curse, and where I had accepted Shabani's magic, only to be beaten that day in Doha. And now it was where I was to build my ladder to science. We walked through the forest, looking carefully at each tree. Finally, we had chosen one that was about 8 feet high, 2 meters. We tore into the trunk with our blades, and after 10 minutes, the tree crashed to the ground. We used our machetes to take off the branches, then stripped thin bark with our hands. By 3 o'clock, we felled and cleaned 2 more additional trees, and we were hoisting them onto our shoulders, headed home. Just behind the kitchen, we set the poles deep into the ground, each one the same distance from each other. Each pole was wrapped in jumbo bags to keep out the termites. We took smaller branches and nailed them sideways like rungs of a ladder, using nails that Joffrey had bought using his pay from the maize mills. By sundown, the tower was complete. It stood 15 feet high and was very strong and sturdy. However, from just a short distance away, its long spindly legs gave it the appearance of a big giraffe. Get some sleep, gents, I said. Tomorrow we raise the machine. I could barely sleep that night and was out the door before the rooster even crowed in the morning. When I rounded the kitchen, Gilbert and Joffrey were already standing by the tower. Look who decided to sleep late, Joffrey said. I was so happy to see them. The windmill's frame weighed about 90 pounds, so about 35 kilograms, and the only way to hoist it up the tower was by rope and by pulley. I didn't have any rope, so I had to borrow my mother's wire clothesline instead. I fastened and I attached one end of the wire to the handle that I made on the windmill from a small piece of bamboo. I climbed the tower with the other end and looped it over the top rung, then dropped it down to Gilbert. From where I stood, I could see over the trees to where the patch of fields and forest joined the highlands. Okay, Gilbert, I yelled, bring it up. Slowly he began to pull. The bamboo handle lifted in the air, followed by a large gangly frame. Easy now. Joffrey stood below me on the lower rung to guide the machine as it climbed. The 3 of us now pulled with all of our strength. Come on, guys, I shouted. Let's see those muscles. I'm pulling as hard as I can, said Gilbert, straining under the weight. Don't let it slip, Joffrey. With each pull, the windmill lurched sideways and banged its cumbersome blades against the wood. A couple of times they got stuck and Joffrey had to get them loose. Little by little, it made its way up the tower. So they're pulling the big machine up to the top. After half an hour, we finally had it close to the top. When it came close, I grabbed the handle and screamed to Gilbert, tie it down! Gilbert looped the wire around the base pole, and the windmill held. Joffrey joined me at the top to secure the machine in its place. The day before, we drilled 2 holes in the wooden poles. My hot nail drill wasn't big enough, so I had to use flat bolts instead, a process that took hours. We'd also asked Mr. Godsten to cut 2 matching holes in the bicycle's crossbar with his welding gun. Standing atop the tower, Joffrey finished the nuts and bolts from his pocket, while I held the frame and tied to align the holes, I could feel it slipping. "Hurry, this thing is heavy," I said. Joffrey slid in the bolts and tightened them with the wrench. Once everything was fastened and secure, we looked at each other and smiled. The machine felt strong and sturdy, or sturdy and very strong. While Joffrey made his way down the tower, I remained on the top, my perch, to take in the scenery. So it's really high up, and they managed to pull this great big thing, the motor, the blades, the bicycle, to the top of this really big tower, so he can see across all of where he lives. To the north, I could see the iron sheet roofs of the trading center and the rows of brown huts that sat behind the market. As I admired the view, I noticed something strange. A line of people had emerged and were heading in my direction. They must have seen the tower from the distance, and they were curious to have a look. "We have visitors," I said. Within minutes, a dozen people gathered at the base and gazed up at the machine. I recognized a few of them as traders and shopkeepers. One was named Galino. "What is this thing?" he asked. Since there's no word in Chichewa for windmill, I used the phrase magesti afepu, electric wind, I answered. "What does it do?" "It generates electricity from wind." "That's impossible," Galino said, laughing. He turned to get a reaction from the crowd. "It looks like a radio tower. What kind of silly toy is that?" "Well," I said, "just stand back and watch." I climbed down from the tower and ran into my room for the final piece. That morning, I found a thick reed and cut a section about 10 inches long. Then I wrapped a long copper wire around the base of a headlamp bulb and strung it through, creating a light socket. So he's created a light. Holding the socket and bulb, I climbed the tower and connected their wires to the ones from the dynamo. As I worked, more and more people arrived, and I could hear them talk and chatter. "What do you suppose he's doing now?" asked a farmer named Banda. "This is the Masala, the crazy man from the scrapyard my children were talking about," another man answered. "Think about his poor mother." Looking out, I saw my parents and sisters at the back of the crowd. Their eyes were wide and their jaws hung slightly open, the way soccer fans look when clustered around a radio. Except this time it was me who had the ball, with only seconds left on the clock. My hands trembled from nerves, but I was confident. I had prepared for this moment for months. "Let's see how crazy this boy really is," I heard someone shout. A steady wind whistled through the tower, mixing the smell of chain grease and melted plastic. Even though the wheel remained locked, the machine groaned against the breeze, as if begging me to release it. I looked down at Gilbert and Joffrey and nodded. Here it goes, I thought. I jerked the wheel loose and the blades began to spin. The chain snapped tight against the crankset and the tire turned slowly. Everything happened in slow motion. "Come on," I said. "Don't embarrass me now." Just then, a strong gust of wind flung me backwards. The tower began to move so much that I wrapped my elbow around a rung just to hang on. Inches above my head, the blades began to buzz like a set of angry propellers on a plane. I clutched the bulb, waiting for my miracle. Then it came, a flicker, a flash, then a burst of bright, magnificent light. My heart nearly exploded. "Look!" someone shouted. "He's made light!" "It's true what he said!" A group of children pushed through the crowd. "Look how it spins!" "Let me see!" I threw my hands into the air and shouted with joy, laughing so hard that I became dizzy. I held the bulb in triumph and addressed the unbelievers. "Electric wind!" I shouted. "I told you I wasn't mad and crazy." One by one, the people began to cheer. They waved their hands and shouted, "What a winner! Well done! You did it, William!" That's right, I said, and now I'm going bigger. Just wait and see. The crowd shouted questions, then gathered around Gilbert and Geoffrey, grilling them for details. Those two guys couldn't stop smiling and grinning. I stayed on the tower, listening to the blades and taking in the scene. I finally came down when the bulb started to burn my hand. My wire wasn't long enough to use the bulb anywhere but the windmill, so late in the afternoon I attached it to the top rung and left it. I was still so high from the experience that I went to the trading center to burn off some energy and relish in the glory. Once I reached the market stalls, I looked back to the valley and saw the light still flickering through the heat waves. "What is that thing?" said a man nearby, holding a sack of tomatoes. "It's catching the wind, just like a helicopter." The tomato seller was my mother's friend Maggie. "Well, the owner is right here. Why don't you ask him?" "Is this true?" he said. "How is this possible?" I explained it to him the way I did everyone. "I still don't understand," he said. "I need to come see it for myself." For the next month, about 30 people arrived each day to stare up at the light. "How did you manage such a thing?" they all asked. "Hard work and lots of research," I replied, trying not to sound too cool and smug. Many of them were traveling businessmen from other districts. To them, the windmill became kind of like a roadside attraction while passing through Windmill. Other people came from other villages with chickens and maize strapped to their bicycles. Women balancing sacks of flour on their heads stopped and spoke with my mother. "God has blessed you," one said. "You have a child who can perform wonders. You'll never complain about kerosene again." The men approached my father. "Your son made this?" "Yes." "Where did he get such ideas?" "From books." "They teach this in school?" "No, he did this on his own." That month, I helped clear the fields and prepare them for planting, working each day with joy in my heart. If I was in the fields near the windmill, I would pause in between swings of my hoe and just watch it spin. One night, I was playing bower with Geoffrey and Gilbert near the barber shop where the lights went out from a power cut. While everyone was cursing the dark, I snuck home and connected the bulb, then ran back. "Oh, I hate these power cuts," a man complained, leaving the barber shop with only half a haircut. "What power cuts?" I said with a smile. "Have you chaps seen my house?" Mr. Ibonga, the barber, leaned out of his shop, still clutching his clippers. "William, I think you take pride in our power cuts, just so you can boast and tell everyone about your electric wind." Perhaps. The next month, I started working on lighting my house using the windmill. To do this, I need loads and loads of electrical wire. But as usual, I had no money to buy any. Then one afternoon, Gilbert and I were at Charity's house when I noticed long sections of copper insulated wire, the very kind I needed, being used as a clothesline. In fact, a whole spool of the stuff sat in the corner of the room. "Hey man," I said to Charity, "how can you play around with this wire when I need it so much?" "Someone had given it to him as payment for Ganyu," he said. "But since you're my cousin, I'll give you a discount." I was on my way to the trading center to look for a job when Gilbert pulled out 100 kwacha and gave it to Charity. Just like that, I had 30 meters of copper wire. "I promise I'll pay you back, Gilbert," I said. "Don't worry about it. Just put lights in your room." Once again, when all hope seemed lost, Gilbert came to the rescue. I ran towards home, clutching the heavy spool, so a big, huge thing of wire that he can use to connect his house to the windmill. As I flew down the trail and into the valley, I could see the windmill spinning in the distance. Now every time I saw it, my stomach did a flip. I unspooled the wire enough to measure the distance from the windmill to my room, then clipped it with my knife. Clutching one end, I climbed the tower. A windmill in motion was a hazardous, dangerous work environment. The blades were spinning so fast I had to be careful, or else I'd end up with a haircut. Also, the dynamo was producing real electricity. As I unhooked the bulb and attached the new wire, I was very mindful not to cross them or I'd get an electric shock. To be safe, I wrapped a jumbo bag, which is plastic and doesn't conduct electricity, around the junction where the wires were tied together. The roof of my bedroom was made from pallets of grass wrapped in plastic sheeting, each supported by several wooden beams, so strong. Standing on the ladder, I wrapped the wire 2 turns around the middle beam, the one nearest my bed, then popped a hole through the pallet and lowered it into my room, so he's attaching the wire to his house. Inside, I made some final attachments, then pulled the light bulb from my pocket. I may not be touching the wall to get light, I thought, thinking back to Gilbert's light switch, but this is close enough. I connected the reed and bulb, and in an instant my room was illuminated, full of light. I ran to the door and slammed it closed, then marveled and stared at the new electricity. For the first time ever, I had my own lighted space. That evening after supper, I lay in bed and just stared up at the bulb. It flickered yellow to the rhythm of the spinning blades outside, bright enough to read the library books I stacked up around me. I heard a knock at the door, and soon my family had crowded into my room. "Look, it's William staying up past the dark," my father said. "Congratulations," said my mother. "We would also like to have lights in our rooms. Do you think you can manage?" "Only if you're okay with having electricity generated by a crazy madman." She laughed. You proved us all wrong in the end. But I will admit, I did worry." My sister Rose then asked, "What if the wind stops blowing?" It was an important question. "The light will go off," I said, "and I'll be stranded. That's why I have plans for getting some batteries." More specifically, I needed something like a car battery so I could store power for the times when the wind was calm. A car battery was also big enough to power the entire house. Once I had one, my family could finally toss out those kerosene lamps and live like modern people in America. And lights were just the first step. The next windmill would pump water for our fields and give us more food. Windmills would be our front line against hunger. The first night with light, I stayed awake reading, explaining physics, trying to prepare for my next step. I read for hours, long after everyone else was asleep, while the termites feasted on the roof and clouds of red dust pushed under the door. As usual, a strong wind was blowing. That's the end of chapter 11. So what was he doing? This whole time, he was just getting his windmill ready. And he attached the wire to bring it into his house so that he could have electricity there. So these were all the parts that he used of different things. The chain, the dynamo, the wheel, the pedal, the chains here. And this was the thing that he had created. Right here, everyone coming around to have a look. That's the first one, with the wire going into his house.